You are standing at the edge of a world where the laws of civilization have frozen solid, dissolved by an all-consuming fever for a metal that promises everything but offers only a cold, glittering grave. The air you breathe does not merely feel cold, it feels sharp, like shattered glass pressing against the lining of your lungs. A reminder, with every inhalation, that human life here is an intruder. Before you lies the Chilkoot Pass, a sheer, terrifying, vertical wall of ice and packed snow, cutting through the jagged teeth of the Yukon Mountains. It looks less like a mountain trail and more like a monstrous, frozen staircase ascending into a blank, unfeeling sky. Ahead of you, stretching upward into the swirling gray mist, is a line of thousands of silent figures. They do not look like men or women anymore, bent double under the crushing weight of 100-pound packs, their faces obscured by frost and thick woolen scarves. They move in a terrifying, synchronized rhythm, one agonizing step every few seconds. No one speaks. To speak is to waste breath. And in this wilderness, breath is the only currency that truly keeps you alive. You can hear the sound of their collective survival, the rhythmic, crunching groan of iron-shod boots biting into compacted ice, the heavy, ragged wheezing of exhausted chests, and the low, mournful howl of the subarctic wind sweeping down from the polar north. This is the gateway to the Klondike. Below you, strewn across the frozen mud of Daya, are the discarded remnants of lives left behind. Velvet-lined jewelry boxes, heavy oak furniture, delicate porcelain teacups, and the bloated, frozen carcasses of horses that collapsed under the weight of human greed before even reaching the mountain's base. It is a surreal, heartbreaking graveyard of ambition. Everyone here was told a lie, a beautiful, seductive lie whispered in the crowded saloons of San Francisco and printed in bold, ink-wet headlines across Seattle, that the rivers of the north were paved with yellow crusts of gold waiting to be scooped up by anyone with the courage to reach down. But as you watch another man lose his footing, his heavy pack dragging him backward down the icy slope into the jagged rocks below, while the line simply closes the gap without a single person stopping to help, the truth becomes terrifyingly clear. The gold isn't waiting to enrich you. It is a siren, luring thousands into a vast, white trap where the greatest enemy isn't the terrain or the hunger or the dark. It is the person standing right next to you. The silence of the Yukon winter is not peaceful. It is heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It presses against your ears until you can hear the frantic, rhythmic drumming of your own heart inside your chest. A desperate reminder that you are still warm, still moving, still human. When the wind drops, the quiet is so profound that the snapping of a small twig 100 yards away sounds like a pistol shot echoing through the skeletal pine forests. You begin to understand that this land does not hate you. It is completely indifferent to you, to the mountain, to the frozen rivers, to the sky that turns a bruised, twilight purple at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Your dreams of wealth mean absolutely nothing. They are as fleeting as the steam rising from your mouth. The seasoned prospectors, the old-timers who arrived years before the madness began, call this madness the Goldites. They watch from the porches of their log cabins with a mixture of pity and quiet amusement as waves of doctors, clerks, lawyers, and factory workers pour off the steamships, their hands soft, their boots pristine, and their eyes wide with an unhealthy, manic light. You see the shift happen in people's eyes within 48 hours of hitting the trail. The polite smiles and neighborly warmth of 19th century society peel away like cheap lacquer when a man's survival depends on carrying a literally vital ton of supplies over a mountain. Flour, bacon, beans, blankets, and tools, all demanded by the Canadian authorities to prevent mass starvation. Generosity becomes a fatal flaw. If you give a starving man a cup of your flour, you are shortening your own lifeline by a day. If you stop to help a stranger rebuild his broken sled, the sun will drop below the horizon, the temperature will plummet to 40 below zero, and the frost will claim your fingers before you can light a fire. The trail becomes a psychological crucible. It transforms ordinary, decent citizens into territorial predators. You watch pairs of lifelong friends, brothers who grew up in the same house, begin to look at each other with quiet, calculating suspicion over the evening campfire. They are measuring the rations. They are calculating who is pulling more weight on the sled. They are wondering, if things get desperate enough, whose strength will fail first? The darkness here has its own weight, an oppressive velvet curtain that drops early and stays late, leaving only a few gray, twilight hours of pale sun that hovers low on the southern horizon before slipping away. In that deep, suffocating dark, the human mind begins to warp. Without the familiar markers of home, the chiming of church bells, the gas lamps of city streets, the comforting hum of a neighborhood, time loses its meaning. You are left alone with your thoughts, huddled in a canvas tent that shivers violently in the mountain gales, listening to the canvas snap like canvas sails on a ghost ship. The stove in the center of the tent glows a dull, angry red, casting long dancing shadows across the canvas walls. In those shadows, the imagination plays cruel tricks. Every rustle of the wind sounds like a thief creeping toward your supply cache. Every creak of the ice outside sounds like the footsteps of someone coming to take what is yours. The gold has ceased to be a currency. It has become a deity, an invisible entity that demands total devotion and total sacrifice. You realize that the search for wealth is no longer about buying a mansion or retiring in luxury. It has morphed into a frantic, desperate struggle to justify the agony you have already endured. To turn back now would be to admit that you broke your body, spent your life savings, and abandoned everyone you loved for a delusion. So, you stay. You push deeper into the frozen interior, down the Yukon River in hastily constructed greenwood boats that groan and splinter against the grinding ice floes. You watch the water freeze solid around you, locking your boat in a vice-like grip, forcing you to abandon the river and drag your frozen world behind you on wooden runners. The physical toll is immense. Teeth loosen in gums due to the early stages of scurvy. Heels split open from the damp and the cold, and hands become permanently calloused and blackened by soot and frostbite. Yet, the psychological disintegration is far worse. The human spirit, when subjected to extreme isolation and unrelenting physical torment, begins to harden, matching the permafrost beneath your feet. As you finally approach the sprawling, chaotic mudslick of Dawson City, where the Klondike River meets the Yukon, the scale of the human tragedy unfolds. This is not a city built for living. It is a camp built for plundering. It is a volatile soup of canvas tents, hastily thrown up spruce shacks, and deep, foul-smelling mud lanes that swallow boots whole. Here, the madness reaches its peak. Men who have spent months starving on the trail arrive to find that the best claims along the bonanza and El Dorado creeks were staked out months ago by the insiders, the sourdoughs. For the latecomers, the late arrivals who sacrificed everything, there is nothing left but the outer rim, the high, frozen hillsides where the gold is buried deep beneath 30 feet of frozen gravel that must be thawed inch by inch. With wood fires, the atmosphere in the town is electric with tension, an unstable mixture of desperate hope and brewing violence. In the crowded, smoky saloons, where the air is thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, wet wool, and unwashed bodies, fortunes are made and lost on rumors whispered in the dark. A single word about a new strike on an unnamed creek can empty a saloon in minutes, sending hundreds of exhausted men rushing out into the blinding, sub-zero night, risking life and limb to chase another ghost. You see men sitting alone in the corners of these establishments, staring blankly into their glasses, their eyes hollow and dead. They have run out of money, run out of food, and run out of hope, yet they cannot leave. They are trapped by the geography and by their own shame. The very gold they came to find has become their prison warden, keeping them bound to a frozen valley where humanity is stripped down to its barest, most animalistic essentials. You realize, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that the first winter hasn't even fully arrived yet. The true test of survival, the deep, dark freeze that will push everyone to the absolute edge of their sanity and morals, is just beginning to settle over the land. You are sitting on a splintered wooden crate inside a damp, windowless boarding house in Seattle, the floorboards vibrating with the heavy rhythmic thrum of the Pacific steamships docked just a block away. The air in this room is heavy with the scent of stale tobacco, cheap whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of wet iron. It is July of 1897, and a strange, infectious madness has just broken out across the American continent. Only days ago, the steamship Portland glided out of the morning mist and tied up at the Schwabacher dock, carrying 68 weather-beaten men and more than 2 tons of pure, unrefined gold packed into weathered deerskin sacks and battered fruit crates. You were there in the crowd when they dragged the wealth down the gangplank. You saw the raw, almost terrifying yellow light of it, reflecting in the eyes of grocery clerks, dock workers, bankers, and policemen. In an instant, a country that had been suffocating under the crushing weight of a 4-year economic depression, where factories stood silent and families queued in the rain for bread, awoke to a frantic, intoxicating dream. The newspapers call it a Klondike paradox. For years, you lived in a world where money was a scarce, cruel master, where a man's worth was ground down to pennies by monopolies and failing banks. Now, the headlines scream that a frozen paradise in the far north is giving away fortunes to anyone with a shovel and the grit to dig. You look down at your hands, calloused from years of low-wage labor, and then at the map spread across your knees. It is a crude, hurried printing, the ink still faintly smudging your fingers. The map shows a spiderweb of routes twisting through the vast, uncharted wilderness of British Columbia and the Alaska Territory, all converging on a tiny, nameless speck where the Yukon and Klondike rivers meet. To stay in the city means a slow, predictable death of the spirit, a lifetime of bowing to landlords and enduring the quiet desperation of poverty. To go means a gamble against nature itself. You do not know it yet, but the moment you buy your ticket, you are not just embarking on a journey north, you are letting go of the moral anchor that has kept you civilized. The transition from the bustling ports of the American West to the chaotic staging grounds of Alaska is a rapid, jarring descent into the primitive. On the overcrowded deck of the steamer, heading toward the inside passage, you are packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others who share your desperate ambition. There are no strangers here, only competitors wrapped in identical, stiff Mackinaw coats and heavy wool trousers. The conversation is a tireless, looping engine of rumors. Which pass is shorter? Which river rapids are lethal? And how much gold a man can carry before his spine breaks. As the ship creeps farther north, the green sunlit forests of Washington state give way to the dark, forbidding fjords of the Alaskan Panhandle. The mountains rise directly out of the black ocean water, their peaks hidden by perpetual, low-hanging clouds that weep a cold, gray drizzle onto the decks. When the ship finally drops anchor in the muddy shallows of Skagway, the illusion of an organized expedition shatters completely. There are no docks here for the massive influx of men and material. You are forced to dump your supplies, thousands of pounds of flour, bacon, and equipment, directly onto the wet, tide-swept rocks. Skagway is not a town. It is an open-air madhouse ruled by the law of the fist and the pistol. The air smells of wet sawdust, animal dung, and the ozone of impending violence. Gangs of con artists and thieves, organized by the infamous outlaw Soapy Smith, move openly through the sea of tents, targeting the naive and the exhausted. You watch a young clerk from Ohio lose his entire life savings in a rigged shell game within an hour of stepping ashore, his face turning a sickly ash gray as he realizes his journey has ended before it even began. Nobody steps in to help him. The environment forces a brutal internal audit. Every man looks at his neighbor not as a fellow traveler, but as a potential thief or a physical obstacle. The physical reality of what you have committed to begins to set in as you look upon your supply cache. The Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, stationed at the summit of the mountain passes, have established a ruthless but necessary law. No stampeders will be allowed entry into the Yukon Territory without a literal ton of provisions. This rule, designed to prevent a catastrophic winter famine, means that every single individual must somehow transport 2,000 pounds of gear over a mountain range, with no roads, no bridges, and no mechanical help. If you cannot afford the astronomical prices of native packers or pack horses, which are already dying by the hundreds on the treacherous trails, your only engine is your own legs. You must divide your supplies into 60 or 80-pound loads, carry them up the trail for several miles, cache them in the snow, and then walk back down to get the next load. To move your entire outfit just 30 miles across the pass requires you to walk nearly 3,000 miles, back and forth over ice, mud, and jagged boulders. The trail becomes a meat grinder for human psychology. You watch the landscape transform into a literal slough of despond. On the White Pass Trail, famously known as the Dead Horse Trail, the mud is so deep and the boulders so sharp that the pack animals drop from exhaustion and broken limbs at every turn. Their carcasses are not cleared away. They are simply trodden into the mire by the thousands of boots pressing behind them. The stench of decaying flesh mixes with the cold mountain air, creating a nauseating atmosphere that clings to your clothes and infuses your food. You find yourself stepping over the bodies of horses, mules, and occasionally the unmarked graves of men who suffered sudden heart failure or strokes. their eyes staring blankly at the gray sky while the relentless human conveyor belt moves around them without breaking stride. By the time you reach the base of the Chilkoot Pass, the psychological transformation is complete. The domestic, orderly world of the United States feels like a dream you had in another lifetime. Your childhood, your family, the quiet evenings by a warm hearth. These memories are worn thin, rubbed away by the constant, agonizing friction of the trail. The mountain has stripped you down to a simpler, more terrifying version of yourself. You no longer look at the grandeur of the snow-capped peaks with awe. You look at them with a quiet, burning hatred. The mountain is an adversary that must be broken, or it will break you. As you prepare for your first ascent up the golden stairs, the final, brutal 1,000-foot ice climb to the summit, you stand in the freezing slush, adjusting the straps of your pack until they cut deep into the raw sores on your shoulders. You look at the man next to you, a former school teacher from Illinois, whose eyes have taken on the flat, glassy look of a predator. He is hoarding a small piece of dried beef, eating it with his back turned to the crowd, his fingers trembling with a mix of cold and paranoia. In this place, the concept of human brotherhood has frozen over. You realize that everyone here is running away from something: poverty, failure, obscurity, or themselves, and that they will gladly step on your fingers if it means getting over the crest an hour sooner. The true winter has not yet fallen, but inside the hearts of the stampeders, the temperature has already dropped below freezing. You are standing at the top of the world, or at least it feels that way, as you take your first gasping breath on the wind-scoured summit of the Chilkoot Pass. Behind you, the terrifying incline drops away into the gray mist of Alaska. Before you lies the vast, silent basin of the Canadian Yukon. The Canadian Northwest Mounted Police stand here in the biting wind, wrapped in heavy buffalo skin coats, checking every man's ledger with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of tax collectors. At the gates of the underworld, they do not care about your blisters, your broken spirit, or your dreams. They care only about the scales. If your flour is damp, if your bacon is rancid, if your gear weighs even a single pound less than the required ton, they point their rifles back down the mountain and tell you to turn around. You watch a man who spent 3 months hauling his life up those ice stairs realize his flour has rotted from the damp trail. He doesn't scream or argue. He simply sits down in the slush, buries his face in his blackened hands, and lets the falling snow cover him. You don't offer him a word. You step around his frozen boots, show your paperwork, and begin the long, jarring descent toward the lakes. Below the summit lies Lake Bennett, a massive lead-colored sheet of water ringed by dense, stunted forests of spruce and pine. By the spring of 1898, this remote alpine shore has transformed into the world's largest, most primitive shipyard. 10,000 men, having survived the mountain passes, are now trapped here, waiting for the ice to break. The sound is deafening, a relentless, chaotic chorus of thousands of whipsaws, tearing through green wood, axes biting into sap-filled trunks, and the heavy thud of wooden mallets driving oakum into the seams of makeshift boats. The air is thick with the sweet, suffocating smell of fresh pine resin and the acrid smoke of hundreds of greenwood campfires. You are no longer a clerk or a laborer. You are a desperate shipwright. You fell trees that are too small and too wet, splitting them into uneven, twisting planks with a 2-man whipsaw, an agonizing process that requires one man to stand in a pit below, showered in a blinding rain of damp green sawdust, while the other pulls from above. The tension at Lake Bennett is a slow-burning fuse. The physical trauma of the mountains has given way to a frantic, restless claustrophobia. Everyone is staring at the lake's ice sheet, which is turning a dark, rotted gray, but refuses to move. You are living in a city of 20,000 predators, all eyeing the same prize, all aware that the first boats to reach Dawson City will claim the remaining unstaked ground on the Gold Creeks. This realization turns the campsite into an arena of intense psychological warfare. Partnership agreements, signed with elaborate flourishes back in Seattle or Chicago, dissolve over the construction of a single hull. If your partner's strokes on the saw are too slow, or if he drops a plank into the mud, you look at him not with frustration, but with a cold, murderous resentment. You watch two brothers from Michigan, men who had sworn to their mother they would stick together through the wilderness, divide their outfit down to the literal fabric of their survival. They split their tent down the center seam with a hunting knife. They use a rusted scale to divide their flour, ounce by ounce, and when they reach their single cross-cut saw, they spend an hour under the gray sky filing it in half, rendering the tool completely useless to both of them. Just so, neither can claim an advantage. This is what the ascent does to the human mind. It strips away the capacity for long-term thought, leaving only a sharp, immediate instinct for self-preservation. When the ice finally breaks, with a sound like an artillery barrage, a deep, booming roar that echoes off the mountain walls, the rush to the water is a chaotic, Darwinian stampede. Men launch boats that are still dripping with wet pitch, unseasoned wood, groaning under the weight of their ton of supplies, completely blind to the lethal river traps that await them downstream. The Yukon River is not a highway. It is a cold, churning labyrinth designed to grind human ambition to pieces. As your crude, flat-bottomed scow sweeps out of Lake Bennett and into the fast-moving current of the river proper, you realize you have no control over your destiny. The green wood of your boat twists and bows under the immense pressure of the water, weeping white foam through every poorly caulked seam. Within days of leaving the lakes, you hit the Miles Canyon and the Whitehorse Rapids, a terrifying stretch of water where the massive Yukon River is violently compressed into a narrow, basalt gorge less than 100 feet wide. The water turns into a boiling white froth, throwing up walls of spray that freeze instantly on your clothes, turning your coat into a stiff, rattling suit of ice armor. As your boat is sucked into the canyon, the speed is intoxicating and terrifying. You can see the splintered remains of earlier boats, wedged into the black rock walls, their supplies floating in the eddies like dead leaves. You watch a boat ahead of you, manned by 4 young men from New York who had been singing saloon songs the night before, hit a hidden reef. The green planks do not just crack, they explode under the hydraulic force of the river. The men are thrown into the 60-degree glacial water. They don't even have time to scream. The weight of their wet wool clothes and heavy boots drags them under the churning froth within seconds. Their bodies swept downstream into the deep, dark pools where the river hides its dead. You don't try to row toward them. To turn your steering sweep even an inch would mean joining them on the rocks. You look straight ahead, jaw clenched, riding the crest of the white water, your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. Survival is no longer a moral choice. It is a mechanical reflex. When you finally float out of the rapids and into the wider, slower stretches of the upper Yukon, The silence returns, heavier and more ominous than before. The river carries you deeper into the interior of the subarctic shelf, through a vast, undulating wilderness of black spruce that stretches unbroken for thousands of miles in every direction. The sun no longer sets, it merely skims along the northern horizon, bathing the landscape in a strange, ghostly twilight that lasts through the midnight hours. This perpetual daylight is a psychological torment of its own. Without the boundary of night, men stop sleeping. They row until their hands are bloody, raw stumps, their eyes bloodshot and unblinking, driven by the terrifying delusion that someone is just around the next bend, pulling ahead of them. You see the toll of this sleepless madness along the river banks. Every few miles, you pass abandoned camps where men have simply cracked under the pressure. You see a man standing knee-deep in the cold mud, systematically throwing his expensive tools into the river, one by one, laughing a high, cracked laugh that carries across the flat water. Another sits on the riverbank, staring into a cold fire, his boat fully loaded but motionless, having simply run out of the mental fuel required to push his arms forward. The ascent has separated the dreamers from the broken, but as the first scattered flakes of an early August snow begin to drift down from the gray sky, you look at your own map and realize the ultimate trap is closing. You are hundreds of miles from civilization. Winter is turning its key in the lock, and the city you are rushing toward is not a sanctuary. It is a cage of gold and mud. You are standing at the high, frozen crest of El Dorado Creek, looking down into a narrow, snow-choked gulch that looks less like a land of golden promise and more like a desolate trench from a forgotten war. It is late November. The sun has abandoned the Yukon sky entirely, leaving only a pale, ghostly bruise of blue light on the southern horizon. For less than 2 hours a day before plunging the world back into a freezing, starlit dark, the temperature has dropped to an unthinkable 45 degrees below zero. At this depth of cold, the air changes its texture. It becomes brittle, almost metallic, carrying a strange, low-frequency hum as the timber of the surrounding spruce trees snaps and cracks like pistol shots in the dark. To breathe without a thick woolen scarf over your mouth is to risk searing the delicate tissue of your throat. Every exhale throws up a thick, white cloud of steam that instantly crystallizes, coating your eyelashes, eyebrows, and beard in a heavy, fragile mask of white ice. You have reached the top. You are one of the fortunate few, a man who holds a verified, registered claim on one of the richest gold-bearing creeks on Earth. Underneath your frozen boots, buried deep within the prehistoric gravel bed of the valley floor, is a fortune that could buy city blocks in New York or estates in San Francisco. Yet, as you look at your kingdom, the bitter irony of your success settles into your bones like the frost. You cannot eat gold. You cannot burn it for warmth. To get to it, you must descend into a hand-dug shaft that resembles a vertical grave, dropping 30 feet through the frozen muck to reach the pay streak. Your entire life has shrunk to a relentless, claustrophobic loop. You chop wood from the dwindling forest, haul the heavy logs down the slippery ladder into the shaft, build a roaring fire at the bottom to thaw a few inches of the permafrost, and wait until the suffocating smoke clears so you can shovel the loose, gravelly mud into wooden buckets. It is a grueling, primitive existence that breaks the spine and hollows out the eyes. The wealth you are extracting is entirely theoretical. Until the spring thaw arrives in May, to melt the creeks and allow you to wash the gold out of the dirt using wooden sluice boxes. Your fortune is nothing more than a massive, unsightly mound of frozen mud and gravel piled high at the mouth of your shaft. This mound is called the dump. Every bucket you hoist up from the dark adds to the pile, and every bucket represents a calculated gamble against your own mortality. The atmosphere along the creeks is thick with an unwholesome, competitive paranoia. You are surrounded by men who have achieved their dreams only to find themselves trapped in a golden prison. There are no fences here, no walls, and no locks that can withstand a desperate man with a pickaxe. You find yourself watching your neighbors with a sharp, predatory vigilance. If their dump grows faster than yours, you wonder if they have hit a richer pocket. If they stop digging for a day, you wonder if they are planning to rob your cabin in the dark. The cabins themselves are small, dark, and suffocatingly claustrophobic. They are built of green spruce logs, chinked with frozen moss and mud that shrinks as the cold deepens, letting in razor-thin needles of icy wind that freeze the water in your kettle within 3 feet of the roaring tin stove. The air inside is a foul, stagnant stew of wet wool, frying bacon fat, unwashed bodies, and the pungent chemical stink of kerosene lamps. In this cramped, dark space, companionship dies a slow, agonizing death. If you have a partner, you know every line on his face, every cough, every repetitive story, and every annoying habit he possesses. The silence between you becomes a heavy, physical presence. You can sit for 6 hours without exchanging a word, staring at the glowing iron of the stove, listening to the wind claw at the canvas roof, wondering how a man can be so utterly alone while sharing a space no larger than a horse stall. In Dawson City, just a few miles down the frozen trail, the isolation takes on a different, more volatile form. The town has become a surreal, landlocked island, cut off from the rest of the human race by 1,000 miles of unnavigable ice. No steamships can reach the docks, no mail can get through the mountain passes, no news from the outside world can penetrate the white wall of the subarctic winter. The United States could be at war. Presidents could have fallen, cities could have burned to the ground, and the 20,000 people trapped in Dawson would know absolutely nothing about it. This absolute severing of ties creates a strange, manic state of mind among the population. The saloons and gambling halls, the Monte Carlo, the El Dorado, the Tivoli, are packed to the doors every single night, with men desperate to escape the silence of their cabins and the terror of their own thoughts. In these establishments, the absurdity of the Klondike reaches its peak because there is nothing else to buy. The values of everyday items distort until money loses all meaning. You see a man who just hoisted $10,000 worth of gold out of the ground gladly exchange a heavy, unrefined nugget for a single shriveled potato to combat the early signs of scurvy bleeding from his gums. A fresh egg is worth more than an ounce of gold dust. A tin of condensed milk is a luxury that can buy a man's loyalty for a week. The floors of the saloons are covered in sawdust to soak up the spilled whiskey, the mud, and the occasional splash of blood. But at the end of the night, the swampers don't just sweep the floors. They carefully wash the sawdust in gold pans to collect the fine yellow dust that slips through the trembling fingers of intoxicated miners. You watch a young man waste an estate on a single night of faro, his face perfectly expressionless as his chips are raked away by a dealer who looks like he hasn't seen the sun in 10 years. The wealth is staggering, but it is hollow. a frantic, desperate dance on the deck of a sinking ship. The ultimate price of this isolation is the slow, systematic erosion of your inner humanity. When you look in the small, cracked mirror hanging over your wash basin, you no longer recognize the person looking back. The eyes are different. They have taken on the flat, hard, unblinking quality of the landscape itself. You have become a creature of pure survival, a machine that converts frozen dirt into yellow metal and yellow metal into another day of life. The moral frameworks of the 19th century, the polite societal rules that seemed so permanent back in the cities of the South, have evaporated completely. They were luxuries intended for a warm, forgiving world. Here, the only truth is the cold, the dark, and the dump of dirt outside your door. As you step out of your cabin into the midnight dark, the northern lights break across the sky, a colossal, silent curtain of electric green and violet fire that twists and dances across the stars, casting a cold, eerie glow over the frozen valley. It is a breathtaking display of cosmic indifference, a visual reminder of just how small, how insignificant, and how utterly forgotten you are in this immense, white wilderness. You look down at your hands, your fingers permanently stained with soot and split into deep, painful cracks by the subarctic dry. You have found the gold. You have conquered the trail. You are at the very pinnacle of your ambition, standing on top of a mountain of wealth that most men can only dream of. Yet, as you listen to the mournful, distant howling of a wolf pack echoing off the high ridges of the ridgeline, you realize the terrifying truth. You have won the gamble against the Yukon, but in the process, you have lost the world you were trying to buy. You are waking up to the sound of a structural groan that makes your heart drop into your frozen boots. It is late April, and beneath the floorboards of your log cabin, the ancient, deep permafrost is beginning to do something it has not done for 10,000 years. It is softening the relentless subterranean wood fires you and thousands of others have burned all winter to thaw. The pay streaks have combined with the first tentative warmth of the spring sun. The ground is literally rotting beneath the weight of the city. Dawson City, once a frozen monolith of ambition, is fracturing into an unstable, foul-smelling swamp. Cabins are listing at terrifying angles as their foundations sink into the thawing muck. The heavy timber, gallows over the mine shafts, are shifting, snapping their iron cables with regular, whip-like cracks that echo through the valleys. The ice on the Klondike River is turning a bruised, rotted black, weeping pools of meltwater that spill over into the crowded lanes of Front Street. The physical collapse of the landscape mirrors a sudden, terrifying fracture in the social order. The spring thaw does not bring relief. It brings a frantic, desperate realization that the clock has run out. The thousands of latecomers who spent the dark winter months hauling wood and digging dry holes on the high hillsides are waking up to the brutal reality of their math, the cost of their survival. The astronomical prices paid for flour, bacon, boots, and wood has completely devoured the value of the dirt they have raised. The dump piles that looked so impressive in the winter moonlight are melting under the spring rains, revealing that most of the gravel is just that, worthless, gray stone with only a few meager flakes of yellow dust to show for a winter of agony. The desperation changes its flavor from a quiet, defensive paranoia to an active predatory panic. The lines outside the Gold Commissioner's office on Front Street turn into violent, shoving mobs as men realize that overlapping claims, shifting creek boundaries, and bureaucratic corruption have rendered their legal titles completely worthless. The Gold Creeks, El Dorado, Bonanza, Hunker, and Last Chance become a vast, mud-drowned battleground. To wash the dump, you need water, but the sudden, violent rush of spring meltwater is a lawless, destructive force. Flash floods rip through the gulches, tearing away the wooden sluice boxes, drowning the shallow shafts, and washing away weeks of accumulated pay dirt into the roaring torrents. Men stand knee-deep in the freezing liquid mud, swinging shovels at their neighbors to defend their water rights. The thin veneer of Canadian law, maintained throughout the winter by the disciplined patrols of the Northwest Mounted Police, begins to fray under the sheer volume of human desperation. There are not enough jail cells, not enough ropes, and not enough officers to contain 20,000 desperate men who realize they have broken their bodies for absolutely nothing. You see the fracturing of old alliances in every camp, the partnerships that survived the dark winter break, apart under the strain of the final tally. When the gold is finally washed out of the gravel and into the riffles of the sluice boxes, the result is an honest, merciless ledger of a man's worth. You watch two lifelong friends from Ohio sit on a log beside their sluice box, a leather poke of gold dust sitting between them. It weighs barely 20 ounces, not even enough to cover the cost of the steamship ticket back to Seattle. One man looks at the gold, then at his partner's calloused hands, and without a word, he reaches down, grabs his half of the poke, and walks away into the brush, leaving his friend alone in the mud. There is no anger, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. The betrayal is quiet, mechanical, and absolute. The wilderness has taught everyone that when the ship is sinking, you do not look back to see who is drowning behind you. As May turns into June, the ultimate insult of the subarctic summer arrives. The mosquitoes. They do not arrive in small clouds. They rise from the black, stagnant pools of the thawing tundra in colossal, suffocating blankets that blot out the sun. They are a relentless, biological torture that drives men and draft animals to the brink of insanity. The air is thick with a constant, high-pitched whine that fills your ears, your nose, and your mouth with every breath. Men paint their faces with a sickening mixture of bacon grease and pine tar to keep the insects from biting through their skin, turning the population of Dawson into a town of blackened, glistening ghouls. The heat becomes oppressive, hovering in the high 80s. But you cannot strip off your heavy wool clothes without being eaten alive. The city becomes an open-air vector for disease. The lack of any sanitation infrastructure during the winter means that the accumulation of months of human waste, garbage, and the rotting carcasses of thousands of horses is suddenly washed into the town's shallow wells and the sluggish current of the Yukon River. Typhoid fever sweeps through the tent cities like a wildfire through dry spruce. The temporary hospitals, set up by the Sisters of St. Anne in log warehouses, are packed to the rafters with men shivering with fever, their skin turning a yellow, jaundiced hue as their organs fail. Death here is no longer a dramatic event. It is a bureaucratic chore. Every morning, wooden carts rumble down the mud lanes of Front Street, collecting the bodies of those who died in their tents during the night, their pockets rifled through by their tent mates before the authorities can arrive. The gold that cost everything cannot buy a drop of clean water or an ounce of medicine. The final shattering blow to the Klondike Empire comes not from the mud, the disease, or the water, but from a single word brought up the river by the first steamship of the summer. In July of 1899, a weathered boat arrives from the mouth of the Yukon, its deck crowded with traders, carrying news that instantly paralyzes the crowds on the waterfront. Gold has been discovered, not in the deep frozen shafts of the interior, and not behind a 1,000-mile wall of ice and mountains. It has been found in the wide, golden sands of the beach at Nomami, Alaska, right on the edge of the open ocean, where a man can wash a fortune out of the surf with nothing but a tin pan. The reaction in Dawson is a terrifying spectacle of mass hysteria. In an instant, the empire of the Klondike is revealed to be a ghost town in waiting. The very men who had spent a year fighting, bleeding, and starving to secure an inch of ground on El Dorado Creek drop their shovels, abandon their cabins, and run for the waterfront. Claims that were worth thousands of dollars an hour ago are traded for a bottle of whiskey or a passage downriver. The saloons empty, the stores are left unlocked, their shelves stripped by frantic crowds. You stand on the high ridge overlooking the Yukon River, watching a fleet of makeshift rafts, canoes, and overloaded steamers push off into the current, turning their backs on Dawson City. They are chasing the next promise, the next horizon, the next golden lie. You realize with a sickening clarity that the madness has no ending. It is a perpetual, looping machine that will consume these men until there is nothing left of them but bones in the sand. You are sitting on the collapsed, rotting sill of a cabin that has slowly been swallowed by the encroaching spruce forest. It is August, but not the August of 1898. Decades have slipped quietly into the dark, and the frantic, screaming energy of 30,000 gold-mad souls has evaporated from this valley, leaving behind a silence so absolute it feels heavy, almost sacred. The air around you carries the sharp, clean scent of damp moss, wild fireweed, and the faint, sweet perfume of decaying wood. Below you, the Klondike River flows on, its waters gray-green and cold, carrying the silt of the high ridges down to the sea just as it did before the first human hand reached down to disturb its gravel. The wilderness is methodically reclaiming its territory. The deep, jagged trenches dug into the earth by desperate miners have been smoothed over by decades of falling snow and summer rains, carpeted in a thick, velvety layer of green tundra moss. The structures that men built to last lifetimes are losing their battle with gravity. Across the creek, the skeletal framework of an old wooden dredge sits tilted in the mud like the ribs of a great, stranded whale. Its iron gears, once roaring with a mechanical hunger that devoured thousands of tons of gravel a day, are frozen solid, coated in a thick, flaking skin of bright orange rust. You look down at your feet and see a half-buried piece of iron, the rusted head of a pickaxe, its wooden handle long since rotted away into the rich, dark soil. It is a tiny, forgotten monument to a monumental delusion, the Great Klondike Gold Rush, which shook the financial foundations of the Western world and captured the imagination of an entire generation, lasted less than 3 years. By the turn of the 20th century, the circus had packed up and left, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a collection of stories that would slowly warp from harsh, agonizing reality into romantic myth. The transition from history to legend is a subtle, deceptive process. Back in the cities of the South, in San Francisco, Seattle, and Chicago, the men who returned from the Yukon did not talk about the scurvy. They did not talk about the terrifying, cold indifference of the Chilkoot Pass, or the way they looked at their brothers with murderous suspicion over a handful of damp flour. The human mind, in its desire to survive its own memories, cleanses the past. The survivors painted over the rot and the madness with a bright, heroic lacquer. They became characters in a grand national adventure story. Writers who spent only a few months in the territory, like Jack London, turned the brutal, animalistic survival of the trail into a philosophical romance, a noble struggle between the primordial spirit of man and the majestic, unyielding power of the North. The public craved this romance. They wanted to believe that the Klondike was a place where ordinary clerks and factory workers could transform into rugged, iron-willed pioneers. They chose to forget the thousands who arrived too late, the men who spent their life savings on a ticket only to die of typhoid in a canvas tent, or those who crawled back down the mountain passes with their bodies broken and their minds permanently shattered. The myth became so powerful that it obscured the physical reality of the place. You see this echo in the old black and white photographs preserved in archives. The long, iconic line of men ascending the Chilkoot Pass looks like a monument to human determination, an artistic masterpiece of collective will. But if you listen closely to the silence of the valley today, you can still hear the true, unedited audio of that hill. The wet, rattling coughs of exhausted lungs, the snapping of horsebone, and the quiet, desperate prayers of men who knew they had made a fatal mistake. The handful of people who stayed behind, the true sourdoughs who refused to join the frantic stampede to the beaches of Nome, became caretakers of a ghost empire. They watched Dawson City shrink from a booming, electric metropolis of 30,000 people down to a quiet, isolated village of less than 1,000. The grand hotels, the opera houses, and the gambling dens that had seen millions of dollars in gold dust pass over their counters were boarded up, their velvet curtains left to rot in the dark, their wood-paneled walls warping under the pressure of the winter freeze. These remaining souls lived among the ruins of an unrepeatable madness. They spent their lives walking through streets where the empty buildings outnumbered the living inhabitants 10 to 1, their footsteps echoing off the false-fronted facades like ghostly applause. For them, the gold was no longer an obsession. It was a historical marker, a dividing line in their lives between the world before the rush and the world after. They could point to a specific bend in the creek and tell you exactly who had struck it rich there, how many tens of thousands of dollars they had pulled out of the dirt in a single week, and how they had managed to spend every single penny of it within a month of returning to civilization. The wealth of the Klondike was uniquely volatile. It seemed to possess a strange, migratory instinct, flowing out of the ground only to disappear into the pockets of steamship companies, saloon owners, lawyers, and con artists. Very few of the men who actually dug the gold kept it. The empire they built was a house of cards, thrown up in a frenzy of hope and knocked flat by the first wind of reality. As the twilight of the subarctic summer begins to deepen, turning the sky a rich, melancholy indigo, the shadows lengthen across the valley floor. The echoes of the Klondike are not just historical, they are deeply psychological. The rush was the final, desperate gasp of the 19th century, a sudden, frantic explosion of individual ambition before the industrial, corporate world of the 20th century closed its doors, it was a place where a man could still believe that his own two hands, a shovel, and a willingness to suffer could change his destiny overnight. That dream is what drew them north, and that dream is what buried so many of them in unmarked graves along the riverbanks. You rise from the rotting log and take one last look at the abandoned valley. The forest is winning. In another few decades, the last of the cabins will have collapsed into the moss. The rusted iron machinery will have dissolved into the soil, and the creeks will have completely forgotten the names that men gave them. The land has no memory of the fever that consumed it. It does not remember the gold that cost everything, or the men who destroyed themselves to possess it. The Klondike has returned to its original state, vast, silent, and entirely indifferent to the desires of humanity. The echoes in the dark are fading, leaving behind only the cold, steady murmur of the river, flowing onward through the wilderness under an unblinking canopy of stars. You are pulling the heavy wool blanket up to your chin, watching the very last embers of the cabin stove fade from a bright, fierce orange to a deep, restful crimson. Outside, the great subarctic night has settled completely over the Yukon, wrapping the world in a blanket of absolute velvet darkness. The wind that howled so fiercely through the high mountain passes during the day has finally died down, leaving behind a silence so deep and profound that it feels almost physical. There are no more sleds to drag. There are no more frozen shafts to dig. The frantic, hammering rhythm of the gold fever has finally quieted, replaced by the slow, steady, and comforting rise and fall of your own breath. The long journey is over, and the wilderness, having tested everything you had to give, is finally permitting you to rest.